to Past to Present, a programme in which we talk to prominent figures from Irish history. You are probably aware that our interview last week with Oliver Cromwell caused something of a stir, particularly in the west of Ireland, where some of our viewers took exception to the remarks made by Mr. Cromwell. As a consequence, our sponsors, Fáilte Ireland, have issued the following statement. Connacht is in fact an area of immense natural beauty and one of this country's most popular tourist destinations, featuring a wide range of cultural and leisure activities offering excellent value for money. We're happy to clarify any misunderstanding which may have arisen as a consequence of Mr. Cromwell's remarks. Anyway, to tonight's programme. Tonight we're going to talk to a political essayist from County Laois whose short life belies the contribution that he made, the influence that he had, that his writings had on Irish history. Admired by men like John Mitchell, Pádraig Pearse, James Connolly, for example, James Fintan Lalor was one of the most original thinkers of the Young Ireland movement, and we're delighted that he's been able to travel across the years to be here with us tonight. Would you please welcome Mr. James Fintan Lalor. Welcome to the programme. Have a seat. It's an honour to have you here.
This is a public meeting?
Of sorts, yes.
For the purpose of...
Well, I am going to interview you. I'm going to ask you questions about your life and your political views.
The last such meeting I attended was at Holy Cross, in the county of Tipperary, for the purpose of establishing a league of tenant farmers.
Yes, well, tonight will be rather less formal than that.
It was, as I recall it, in the year 1847. I was harangued by a scoundrel by the name of William Connor. The platform collapsed, and I had to be carried to a nearby tavern to be resuscitated.
Yeah, well, I'm sure nothing of that sort is going to happen tonight, but we will, with your permission, we will take questions from the audience before we conclude.
Will we indeed?
Now, I want to go back, if I may, to the very beginning. You were born in Tennekill in County Laois on the 10th of March, 1807.
Queen's County.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I think you'll find Tinnakill is in Queen's County.
It was Queen's County.
Has it moved?
No. Queen's County is now Laois, and Portlaois is the new name for what in your time was Maryborough.
I see. Am I still James Fintan Lalor?
Yes.
Good.
Now, the Lawlors are, of course, a well-known family, a very old Laois family. James, a very popular name within the family. But where does the Fintan come from?
Saint Fintan is the patron saint of the parishes of Raheen, Ballyfin and Mountrath. My father saw fit to call me at least partly in his honour, though exactly how saintly I have been is a matter of some considerable debate.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about your father in a moment.
Must we?
Your early education, though, was mostly conducted at home by visiting scholars until you enrolled in Carlow Lay College at the age of 15.
Yes, but I only attended for about a year due to ill health.
The historian Maurice Lennon, he was a schoolmate, he's quoted, I have the quote here, he described you as an undersized, weakly and rather deformed, ill-adapted to the wear and tear of school life.
One should never trust historians. I had the misfortune to damage my spine in a fall as a child, you see, so I was ill-adapted to the wear and tear of any kind of life. What refuge there was to be found in books, however.
Which books?
Let me see. Swift, Addison, Bacon, Milton. In my rare romantic moments, Wordsworth, Walter Scott, Alexandre Dumas, French contemporary writers such as Rousseau, Lamartine, Louis Blanc.
Thomas Davis?
Of course. Our own Thomas Davis. Davis, Dillon, Duffy. They were at the vanguard of a new movement for the revival of the national spirit. So I was an avid reader of their newspaper, The Nation. I pored over each successive number again and again, finding in its pages ideas of manhood, nationhood, and independence that I had begun to dream of for Ireland.
Your father was active in politics. Honest Pat Lalor. He became MP for Queen's County. But now he first came to prominence, though, in the Tithe War of 1831. For some of our audience who might not know, what exactly were tithes?
Tithes are a form of tax payable to the church, the Protestant church, whether one was a member or not.
And your father essentially led a boycott, a campaign to boycott the
Boycott?
payment.
What is that?
Oh, right. Since your time, of course, to refuse to have dealings with somebody or refuse to buy their produce. What do you remember about that campaign?
In Maryborough, what do we call it now?
Portlaoise.
Portlaoise. At a meeting such as this, my father took occasion to refer to the tithe system, and in so doing, made the astounding declaration that he would never again pay tithes, but that in so doing, he would violate no law, that the tithemen may confiscate his property, but that his countrymen, he was proud to say, respected him, and he thought that none would buy or bid for his confiscated property if exposed for sale.
And what did happen to the property?
25 of his sheep were confiscated as payment of tithes. However, he had branded the word tithe in large red letters on their flanks, and as a consequence, no buyer could be found in Ireland. The sheep were shipped to Liverpool. No one would bid for them there. They were driven to Manchester, then to Leeds. Still, no buyer could be found. People stood together against injustice. Inaction was in itself action. This was a form of passive resistance inspired by the Quakers, you see. The sheep, it was said, died unsold by the side of the road, but the system of collecting tithes was eventually reformed.
And did this form of passive resistance have an influence on your future philosophy?
Undoubtedly. Every country has its own kind of guerrilla warfare, and I felt that the tithe war presented a good specimen of Ireland's kind. And I believe that some such movement, gradually developing into regular warfare, could instigate an Irish struggle for independence.
Now, in a moment, I want to talk to you about your first extraordinary letter to Charles Gavin Duffy.
The first letter of St. Fintan to the Apostles.
But before that, I want to talk to you about an even more extraordinary letter. This was written in June of 1843. You wrote to the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, and you offered your services to secretly inform on the Repeal Association with a view to destroying it.
Yes.
Now, this is 1843. Repeal is the burning issue of the day. The repeal of the Act of Union, which deprived Ireland of its parliament. Daniel O'Connell is in his pomp and is the leader of the Repeal Association. The Nation newspaper, the paper you admired so much, was at that time staunchly pro-repeal, as was your father. But here you are, offering to destroy the repeal movement. Do you recall that letter?
Vaguely. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, well, I have the wording of it here. You wrote, I have long been and felt an absolute necessity which exists that all agitation
for political means should entirely cease. I am most anxious that the present repeal movement should be speedily and safely suppressed. To effect that object, I wish to contribute whatever little aid it may be in my power to give.
Now, why did you offer to destroy the one thing that most of the Irish political establishment was working towards?
I am one of those who never joined the Repeal Association, one of Mr. O'Connell's creeping, crawling, cowardly creatures. I didn't join the agitation because I saw, not from reflection, but from natural instinct, the same instinct that makes one recoil from eating carrion, that the leaders and their measures, means, and proceedings were intrinsically and essentially vile and base. You see, before I embarked in the boat, I took one look at the crew and the commander, and I knew her at once for a leaky collier smack with a craven crew to man her, and a sworn dastard and forsworn traitor at the helm.
I take it you are not an admirer of Daniel O'Connell.
I wouldn't trouble myself to cross Sackville Street to hear him.
Oh, well, you mightn't want to hear this. Sackville Street is now called O'Connell Street.
What folly.
So, if repeal wasn't the big issue for you, what was?
Land, of course. A mightier question was in the land, one beside which repeal dwarfs down to a petty parish question. And if the magnitude and magnificence of that land question be not readily apparent, then it was because every question is little until some one man makes it great.
And you wanted to be the man who made the land question great?
Yes, of course.
Michael Davitt, who was the founding father of the Land League, again subsequent to your time, described you as the prophet of the Irish revolutionary land reform.
Well, he ought to know.
Now, you first came to the attention of the political establishment in January 1847. You wrote a letter to Charles Gavan Duffy, and much of that letter contained your opposition to repeal, which we've just spoken about. Another issue you raised was the question of non-violence. The repeal movement was committed to working within the law. You had your doubts.
As regards the use of none but legal means, any and all means might be made illegal by Act of Parliament. Therefore, such pledge was passive obedience. Let England pledge not to argue the question by the prison, the convictship, or the halter, and I would readily pledge to argue the question in any but physical logic.
The first article that you had published was printed in The Nation in April of 1847. This one was a proposal for an agricultural association between the landlords and the tenants. It's effectively an open letter to the landlords of Ireland.
My general object in addressing them was that of calling attention to the effects which I felt must follow present events if the cause of those events be not checked or changed.
By present events, you meant the famine.
Of course, within sight and sound of this dismal calamity, amid the actual horrors of every passing hour, it was scarcely possible to look far into the future or to take thought or care for remote results. In the presence of famine, men are blind to its effects, but it was doing its work in the dark, and no watch had been set or warning raised.
The article contained a stark warning to the landlords of Ireland that society must change or perish.
Yes. Yes. So, you see, political rights are but paper and parchment. It is the social constitution that determines the character of a people.
It's stirring stuff.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
Would you read the relevant passage for us?
If you insist. The constitution of society that has prevailed in this island can no longer maintain itself or be maintained. It has been tried for generations. It has now at least been fully and finally tested, and the test has proved fatal. It was ever unsound and infirm and is now breaking to pieces under the first severe experiment, an experiment which that of any other country would have easily withstood. Nor heaven nor human nature will suffer it to be re-established or continue. Society stands dissolved, in effect as well as of right. It stands dissolved, and another requires to be constituted. The power of framing a new order is in your hands, my lords and gentlemen, if you choose to exercise it. The work of reconstruction belongs of right to you. It is in emergencies and occasions like the present, rather than in ordinary and settled times, that a national aristocracy is required, and if they be not worthy of such occasions, they are worthless altogether. Ireland demands from you now something more than her present dole of daily food, a mode and system of providing full food for herself. She looks to you for this, that she be not condemned to live as a beggar on public alms, nor as a pauper on public works and poorhouse rations, but enabled to find a mode of making her bread in all future time by free, unforced, and honest labour. Thank you.
So, was that in essence your argument with repeal? You wanted more than just a degree of independence from England. You wanted major social change.
Well, as I said, political rights are but paper and parchment. It is the social constitution that determines the condition and character of a people, that makes and molds the life of a man.
But why appeal to the landlords? Why not just call for revolution?
Revolution could come later. Besides, in some respects and to some degree, the landlords were considered specially charged with the current calamity, the famine. And their rights of ownership were thought by many to be the only obstacle to the creation at once of a sound system of social prosperity and happiness.
So you were giving the landlords a chance to come on side?
In a manner of speaking, yes. Their aid was most desirable if accorded on terms and in a mode which would be thought likely to contribute to general benefit and happiness. On other terms, the service and aid of the landlords would not be acceptable, and the prevailing anarchy would be protracted, terminating possibly in violent convulsion, from which the landlords would come out the losers. To ensure against such a contingency, it was necessary, I believed, that the landlords should combine and cooperate with the people from whom, for long ages, they had stood apart.
Of course, most of the Irish aristocracy considered themselves to be English, or at least loyal to the crown.
Yes.
So you were asking them to, I suppose, put on the Irish jersey, as it were.
I don't understand.
No, you were calling them to declare allegiance to Ireland, then.
Yes, they must be henceforth not a foreign garrison, but a national guard, for these are the duties of nobility. Otherwise, they throw their very existence upon English support, which England might soon find too costly to afford. You see, a union between parties of the same class, a union of landowners with each other, was adequate to no purpose. The union required was a union between all classes of whom the people are composed. The landlords were powerless without the people beside or behind them.
But our history books tell us that landlords and tenants are traditional enemies. Did you really think that they could be brought together?
Look, there are many important questions at issue between landlords and landholders. Why should we not meet together and settle them amicably?
An impossible task, surely.
A work impossible to man, and one which he never yet undertook, true, but neither can you form in all its parts the smallest plant that grows, but sow the seed, and the plant forms. Lay deep and strong the only foundation that is firm under the foot of a nation, a secure and independent agricultural peasantry.
So we're back to the land again.
Yes, the land. Always the land. On it and out of it springs the mechanic, the artisan, the trading dealer. Sustained by it, these enlarge and gather and solidify into companies, corporations, classes, into great manufacturing and mercantile systems. Without it, there is neither manufacturer, nor trade, nor means to make it. For it is agriculture alone that furnishes these means. Food is our first want. To procure it, our first work. It is first in order of necessity, nature, and time. My general object, and the formation of a new social economy, resolved itself into the formation of a new agricultural system.
Was all of this theory of yours, was that all inspired by events around the famine?
To some extent, yes. You see, the landlords had already settled among themselves the entire future economy of the country, disposed of the existence of millions of people. The small land holdings were to be consolidated into large farms. The small landholders converted into independent laborers. Those independent laborers were, of course, to be paupers. Those paupers to be supported by a poor law. That poor law to be in the hands of the landlords to manage and administer. Thus was to be got rid of the surplus of population beyond which the landlords required.
The next letter you had published was just a month later. It was in May 1847.
Yes, I was busy and there was much to say.
Now, in this article, you outline the effects of the famine and you lay the blame squarely on the shoulders of the landowners. Was this fair?
Yes. Take the small farmer, of whom there were millions at this time. He sowed grain for his landlord. He planted potatoes for himself. The corn paid the rent. The potatoes fed the farmer. During the famine, this man did according to custom, but the potato failed. Still, the landlord took the corn. The tenant paid his rent, was forced to pay his rent, had to sell his grain crop to pay it, and was forced to pray to man as well as to God for his daily bread.
Well, the landlords might tell a different story.
The landlords always tell a different story and have the means to tell it. The landowners are in Parliament and the compositor's room. The tenant cultivators are not. I say and assert that the landlords took entire possession of the year's harvest. The food for this year's subsistence, the seed for next year's crop, the landlord took it all. He stood to his right and got his rent, and hunger was in 500,000 homes, all pined and wasted, sickened and drooped. The strong man, the fair maiden, the little infant. The landlord got his rent.
The third and the final letter that you published in The Nation dealt with the formation of a national council. That was taking place in Dublin at the time, but you didn't think it was representative enough.
Well, I knew that of necessity it would consist effectively of landowners only. But no association of landowners acting alone could settle a single question of all those that were fermenting in every heart and every household throughout the island. So I proposed an alternative arrangement, as well as a landowners association, that a tenant league or association of tenant farmers be established, and that also a trade society for the revival and promotion of Irish industry be formed. Now, those tenant league and trade committees should come together, consult and determine upon such questions as affected their interests, and then be empowered to enter into agreement with the Landowners Association on all those several questions.
A form of social partnership.
If you wish.
But your proposals for the expanded National Council fell on deaf ears.
Sadly, yes.
As a result of which, you fell out with some of your contemporaries, including John Mitchell. A letter you wrote to him around that time contains one of your most quoted passages. What did you say about repealing the conquest?
My object is to repeal the conquest, not any part or portion, but the whole and entire conquest of 700 years. That the absolute ownership of the lands of Ireland is vested of right in the people of Ireland. That they, and none but they, are the first landowners as well as the lawmakers of this island.
Now, you decided to take the initiative yourself at this stage. You organised a meeting at Holy Cross in Tipperary with the intention of setting up a league of tenant farmers. What do you remember about that meeting?
It was in the year 1847, September 19th to be precise. Over 4,000 souls had gathered at the Fair Green in Holy Cross. 8 resolutions were proposed and passed by general acclamation. As I was delivering my concluding remarks, one William Connor, a man with whom I had been previously acquainted, began to harangue me in a most unseemly manner, declaring that tenant rights were delusional. I was forced to physically remove him from the platform, a maneuver which caused said podium to collapse underneath us. From a somewhat undignified position lying prostrate on the grass, I declared the meeting closed and was carried to a nearby tavern, followed by a large portion of the crowd, the balance remaining to listen to the ravings of Connor.
Not exactly an auspicious start to any organisation.
Sadly, no. Subscriptions to the Tenant League failed to materialize, a situation not helped by my father's public condemnation of the enterprise. At his urging, I forswore politics and returned to Tinnakill.
But it wasn't long before you were writing again, this time a new journal entitled The Irish Felon. You had high hopes for that publication.
Yes, it was my wish that the Felon Office be organized and animated as a great political organization, and I, for my part, had entered into it with the hope and determination to make it an armed post, a fortress for freedom to be, perhaps, taken and retaken again and yet again, but never to surrender or stoop its flag till that flag shall float above a liberated nation.
And once again, you used its pages to outline your opposition to repeal.
If I was to stake life and fame, it must assuredly be for something better and greater, more likely to last, more likely to succeed, and better worth success than repeal. And a stronger passion, a higher purpose, a nobler and more needful enterprise was at that time fermenting in the hearts of the people. Independence, full and absolute independence for this island and for every man within this island. Ireland her own and all therein, from the sod to the sky. The soil of Ireland for the people of Ireland, to have and to hold from God alone who gave it.
Did you believe that you could bring the majority of the people away from repeal and around to your way of thinking?
When a greater and more ennobling enterprise is on foot, every inferior project and proceeding will be left in the hands of old women, of dastards, impostors, swindlers, and imbeciles. All the strength and manhood of the nation will throw themselves into the loftier undertaking and flock around the banner that floats nearest the sky. There go the young and the gallant, the gifted and the daring, and there too go the wise, for wisdom knows that in national action, littleness is more fatal than the wildest rashness.
In this article, you also suggested that the landlords, if they didn't like your proposed scheme of things, should just pack their bags and leave. Isn't that a bit harsh?
What? Is your sympathy for a class so great, and your sympathy for a whole people so small? For those same landlords were treading out the very existence of a people. It was a mere question between a people of 8 millions and a class of 8,000. They or we must quit the land. The landlords had served us with a general writ of ejectment. Wherefore I said, let them get a notice to quit at once.
What about the right of ownership of property? Couldn't the landlords claim that the land was theirs by law?
No one has a higher respect for the real rights of property than I have, but I do not class among them the robber's right by which the lands of Ireland were held in fee from the British Crown. I acknowledge no right of property which takes the food of millions and leaves them a famine.
You were unique among your peers in not simply blaming the English for Ireland's difficulties.
Well, the landlord's crime it was, and not England's, that Ireland stood where she did. Or rather, it was our crime for having borne them for so long. The question between them and us, I felt, must sooner or later come to a deadly issue.
Now, speaking of deadly issues, your next article for The Felon, published in July 1848, stepped up a gear and called for the organisation of armed felon clubs.
Well, the Felon had not been established for the mere purpose of theorising, but for that of acting too. You see, a meeting that spreads over miles, an association that covers the island, a movement that continues through the years, may each alike be just as much a mere theorist and talker as any one individual man. And such had been the Irish repeal movement up to that day. What was Conciliation Hall? What was Tara?
By Tara, I presume you mean O'Connell's monster meeting there, yeah?
Yes, I do. 1 million of men stood there. What did they do? Speculated, spouted, cheered, resolved, declared, petitioned, and adjourned. With the Felon, we had resolved not only to advise others to act, but to assist them also, to the utmost of our means and the best of our ability.
You were talking about setting up an armed organisation, weren't you?
Most certainly. We had determined to set about creating a military organisation of which the Felon Office was to be the centre and citadel.
And what kind of people were you hoping to attract?
Anyone who was qualified to form or lead a company or section of pikemen, or who was able to address a public meeting, or who was competent to write a paragraph fit to appear in print.
Qualified to lead or form a company of pikemen?
Yes.
Now, we're into interesting and controversial territory, I think. The argument between the use of moral force and physical force. This is an argument that's cast a long shadow over Irish history.
Yes, it has.
So, were you advocating physical force, a military insurrection?
It's not as simple as that. I held that there was yet another class of means and mode of force better founded in moral right, something I came to call moral insurrection.
Explain moral insurrection.
Its theory may briefly be stated as founded on the principle of natural law, a principle beyond dispute. Firstly, no man has any right to assume any authority or jurisdiction whatsoever over any other man without the consent of that man. And secondly, that should he assume to exercise such authority, that other man is not bound to obey. And thirdly, that should he try to enforce such obedience, he may be and ought to be resisted by any and every means whatsoever.
So, civil disobedience backed up by physical force.
In a manner of speaking, yes. I believed in taking quiet and peaceable possession of all the rights and powers of government, and proceeding quietly to exercise them, and then in maintaining and defending the exercise of those rights and powers should they be attacked. Moral insurrection is worthless without military might to sustain it, and unless one is prepared to use that force.
So what's the difference then between moral insurrection and military insurrection?
Nothing more in practical effect than the difference between the defensive and the aggressive use of physical force. A difference, however, which is often important, whether as regards moral right or mechanical efficacy. To be successful, I felt the fight must be a defensive one. The English force is entrenched and fortified. You must draw it out of position, break up its mass, break its trained line of march and maneuver. You cannot organize or train or discipline your own force. You must therefore disorganize, untrain, and undiscipline that of the enemy. You must make the hostile army a mob as your own will be. Force it to act on the offensive and oblige it to undertake maneuvers for which it was never constructed.
You've just described guerrilla warfare.
Have I?
Pretty much. Now, in the same article, you go on to describe how the effects of the famine were, well, the effects that they were having on small farmers. They were playing into the hands of the landlords who were using the disaster to clear their land of tenants.
Such was the case, for there was a sort of revolution beginning which would leave Ireland without a people, unless it be met and conquered by a revolution which would leave it without landlords.
You finish this particular article by calling for a link between the repeal efforts and the land question. You used a now famous analogy, that of the railway carriage and its engine.
Yes, to prevent this English victory and at the same time to achieve independence, the only form in which repeal could ever be carried, there was, I was convinced, but one way alone, and that was to link repeal to some other question, like a railway carriage to the engine. And such a question there was in the land.
So we're back where we started, with the land.
Yes, the land, always the land, and its ownership from the sod to the sky.
Well, now, the felon obviously had an impact from the start, because on the 7th of July, 1847, after the publication of just one issue, the office of the paper was raided. What exactly happened?
All papers and manuscripts were confiscated, and the impression for the second edition was seized. Earlier, a warrant had been issued for the arrest of the editor, John Martin. The hand of the English government had pointed to the felon as the foe which it hated and feared the most.
Despite the raid, though, the second edition of The Felon was published surreptitiously, and this contained one of your most celebrated articles, The Faith of a Felon, because I think, fearing arrest yourself, you wanted to give a full account of your political theory.
I hastened to put my principles on record.
And what were those principles?
Years previously, I had perceived that the English conquest consisted of two parts combined into one whole, the conquest of our liberties and the conquest of our lands. I saw clearly that the reconquest of our liberties would be incomplete and worthless without the reconquest of our lands. The lands were owned by the conquering race, or by traitors to the conquered race. They were occupied by the native people. I selected as the mode of reconquest to refuse payment of rent and resist process of ejectment.
The rent strike you mentioned, how do you see that working?
There were four elements to it. One, that in order to save their own lives, the occupying tenants of the soil of Ireland ought, the following autumn, to refuse all payment of rent and arrears of rent then due. Two, that they ought to refuse and resist being made landless beggars under the English law of ejectment.
This was because if tenants sought any aid or assistance during the famine, they would have to get out of their holdings in order to get it.
That is correct. And three, that they ought further, on principle, to refuse to pay any rent until the people had met in National Congress to decide what rents they were to pay and to whom they were to pay them. And four, that the people, on grounds of policy and economy, ought to decide that those rents should be paid to themselves, the people, for public purposes.
If your proposed rent strike was to come off, how did you think the authorities would react?
The English government would have to choose whether to surrender the landlords or to support them with the armed power of the empire. If the government were to determine to come to the rescue and relief of its garrison by infantry, cavalry, and cannon, and attempt to lift and carry the whole harvest of Ireland, then I, for one, was prepared to bow with humble resignation to the dispensations of Providence. We must only try to keep our harvest, to offer peaceful, passive resistance, to barricade the island, to break up the roads, to break down the bridges, and, if needs be and occasion offer, surely we may venture to try the steel.
You had high hopes that the method of moral insurrection might actually pave the way for similar revolts abroad, didn't you?
I wanted to put Ireland foremost, the head of the nations, to set her aloft in the blaze of the sun, to make her for ages the lodestar of history. Would she take the path I pointed out? Or onward and ever would wretched Ireland come limping and lagging hindmost?
Well, we know that Ireland came limping and lagging hindmost for some considerable time after this.
Sadly, yes.
Now, you accused the landlords and the government in London of exploiting the famine, but by proposing radical reforms in the middle of this crisis, weren't you doing exactly the same?
No, I distinctly refused to do so. True, I attested and urged the plea of utter and desperate necessity to fortify Ireland's claim, but not to found it. I rested it on no temporary or passing conditions, but on principles that were permanent, imperishable, and universal.
You go on in this article to expand on your theories about the right to property.
Well, to any plain understanding, the rights of private property are simple. It is the right of a man to possess the substance and use of that which he has himself created. But no man can plead any such title to a right of property in the substance of the soil. The earth and all it spontaneously produces is the free and common property of all mankind, of natural right and by the grant of God. No man can claim acquisition of any part or portion thereof without the common consent and agreement of all other men.
And I mean, those rights, they're obviously well thought out and they're well expressed, but what do they mean for Ireland?
In many countries besides this, the lands were acquired and long held by right of force or conquest, but in most of them the laws and settlement of conquest had been modified to a greater or lesser extent. In Ireland alone they remained unchanged, unmitigated, unmollified in all their original ferocity. And the people, I believed, must now abolish them, or be themselves abolished. And that was therefore the more urgent business.
And of course, becoming the more urgent because the famine was ravaging the countryside.
Indeed.
And on top of that, the authorities suppressing the Felon and other like-minded newspapers.
Yes, gentlemen and even ladies were collared and pinioned and the Felon torn from their hands. The government had assailed the Felon and two others, the Nation and the Tribune, with the clear intent of crushing those journals and smothering down the voice of the Irish people by naked force.
And as a result, the last two articles you wrote were they were entitled Resistance and Clearing the Decks. They have a real sense of urgency about them.
Yes.
And a certain amount of despondency as well, perhaps, at the lack of success of a campaign that you say had been going on for about 18 years.
As hitherto conducted, it had been the most disgraceful in character and results that any nation of men had ever been employed in. There was force enough in this island to bring the contest to a successful issue at any time. Not lack of force, but disunion, dishonesty, defective courage, and faults of conduct had prevented this.
So you're talking about a lack of leadership?
Very much so. It is never the mass of a people that forms its real and efficient might. It is the men by whom that mass is moved and managed. All the great acts of history have been done by a very few men. Take half a dozen leaders out of any revolution on record, and what would have been the result? We wanted only competent leaders, men of courage and capacity. Those leaders were yet to be found. Could Ireland furnish them? The first blow, I believed, would bring them out.
But while you were preaching action, many around you were urging caution.
Well, mark you this and recollect it. Somewhere, somehow, and by somebody, a beginning must be made. And the first act of resistance is always and must ever be premature, imprudent, and dangerous.
This was July 1848. You were essentially calling for a rising by September.
Well, yes, if allowed to choose my own time, I certainly would choose that time when the full harvest of Ireland was stacked in the haggards. But not infrequently, God selects and sends his own seasons and occasions. If opportunity arose, we must dash at that opportunity. Wherefore, let us fight in September if we may, but sooner if we must. Remember, somewhere and somehow and by somebody, a beginning must be made. Who would strike the first blow for Ireland? Who would draw first blood for Ireland? Who would win a wreath that would be green forever?
But events were moving on at quite a pace. In July, the Felon's editor, John Martin, was arrested, as were Charles Gavin Duffy, Thomas Francis Marr, and Michael Doheny. And on the 21st of July, the Confederate Council met, and they met in order to establish an executive revolutionary committee. And that was a forum that you failed to get elected to.
True. Sad, but true.
The Confederate leadership spent a week trying to rally support for an insurrection with little support. Where were you during this time?
On July 24th, I repaired to Tipperary, where I encouraged as many as would listen to prepare themselves for revolution. On July 28th, the authorities stormed the house in which I was being sheltered and confined me at Templemore. From thence, I was brought to Nina and 2 weeks later to Newgate Prison in Dublin. For want of health, I was released in November.
By this point, the Confederacy was in disarray. There were various conspiracies and meetings, various attempts by you and others to establish new radical newspapers, all to no avail.
A very dispiriting time.
Do you remember where you were on the night of the 16th of September, 1849?
You're beginning to sound like a magistrate. It had been resolved to launch simultaneous uprisings in numerous locations, but our means were not adequate. We wanted for men, and while some came, many faltered. Only at Cappoquin did battle commence, and there but one constable was slain. At Cashel I commanded but a handful of men. We waited through the night for our fellows to come, but none did. At dawn we dispersed, unused, untested, unmanned. That was the end. The coffin lid had closed on the last hope of the living generation.
In the weeks after that debacle, I think you were planning your own newspaper, but winter saw a serious deterioration in your health.
The strain of the previous months, travelling, hiding, jail, took their toll.
You died in Dublin on the 27th of December 1849.
I know. I was there.
I'd like to talk to you about your legacy.
Very well.
I'd like you to read some of the things, or I'd like to read rather to you, some of the things that have been said of you.
If you wish.
Pádraig Pearse said of you that your new gospel was self-luminous, delivered in the ringing voice of an angel. The Lord God must have inspired the poor crippled recluse, for no mortal man could of himself have uttered the things he uttered.
I pray to that same God that is not all that has been said of me.
Well, perhaps this will please you more. James Connolly, writing in his pamphlet Labour in Irish History, he's got this to say about you. The palm of honour for the clearest exposition of the doctrine of revolution, social and political, must be given to James Fintan Lawler. All his writings are so illuminating that we find it difficult to select from the mass any particular passages which more deserve reproduction than others.
That last sentence I didn't quite hear.
All his writings are so illuminating that we find it difficult to select from the Mass any particular passage which more deserves reproduction than others.
Thank you.
Are you ever flattered by such praise?
It is of no consequence.
Are you aware of the obituary that Joseph Brennan wrote for you?
I don't think so.
Well, I have it here, somewhere.
As a political writer, he was never excelled. Without reference to the wisdom of his remarks, I fearlessly assert that his style was the perfection of its species. Ireland has produced no abler man, no truer patriot, none, I assert, that better deserves a wreath which shall be green forever. Something like that.
No, that's it exactly. Now, I'd like to finish up, if I may, by talking to you about the current state of Ireland. I don't know how much you know about it.
Too much.
A couple of people in the audience have questions for you, if that's okay. Can we have our first question, please? Let's just have the lights up on the audience. Where the mic is coming to you. This is
James Finton. We're in the middle of an economic crisis of unprecedented level. Some people say we're finding it very, very difficult to get out of it. How do you believe we're being well served by our political leaders?
I should point out that this is Mr. Charles Flanagan, TD, and, Chairman of the Fine Gael Party.
We are living in the midst of a social anarchy in which no man knows with certainty what he is or what he can call his own. Never was government or guidance more necessary to a people, but government or guidance there is none. An extreme and extraordinary case has arisen, one that seldom arises in modern times, and not to be treated by any ordinary law. A new structure of society has to be created.
I think do we have a second question from the audience?
I don't know, James, if you're aware of this, but in recent times we've had the spectacle of hearing former bank executives laughing and joking about taking the country for a ride. What do you make of that?
For years we have seen men in Ireland alternately trading on the government and trading on the country and making money by both. And you cannot imagine to what extent the public mind has been affected with a feeling of suspicion by the circumstance, a feeling deepened by all we see and know of ourselves, for the craving to get money, the niggard reluctance to give money, the coward fear of losing or laying out money is the bad and coarse point that is most apparent in all classes of our people. I often fear it argues an utter absence of heroism from the national temperament. Elsewhere they serve their country for their country's thanks or their country's tears. Here they serve it for their country's money.
Thank you very much indeed for the questions. I want to finish up with this question to you. Much of what you've spoken about here tonight, much of what you wrote about in the past concerns the land and the ownership of it. And the present crisis was caused to a large extent by land, by landlords, by developers, by speculators. Would it be fair to say that in nearly 170 years, nothing has changed?
Let no people deceive themselves or be deceived by constitutions or charters, articles and franchises. These are paper, parchment, waste and worthless. Let laws and institutions say what they will. This fact will be stronger than all laws and prevail against them. The fact that those who own your lands will make your laws and command your liberties and your lives. Those who own your lands will make your laws and command your liberties and your lives.
James Finton Lawler, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. That's it. That's it for tonight. As we approach next week, the anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf, I'll be talking to Brian Boru. Until then, good night.